I start? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's my immense pleasure to introduce to you sculptor, performer, video artist, professor, and writer Harry Dodge. I met Harry for about 3 minutes waiting in a CalArts hallway in 2013. That's the extent of our crossover, which I wouldn't even count as two beings' paths aligning, although I guess they did. My more substantial interface with Harry, like so many others in this room, is through his book, My Meteorite. Without the random, there can be no new thing, published in 2020. And his partner, Maggie Nelson's book, The Argonauts, published in 2015, of which he is the subject. And like many, I feel I know Harry way more than I actually do, which is always a bit of the case with visiting artists and much more extreme here. I bring this up because through sculpture, video, writing, and his teaching at CalArts and Bard College, he takes on epic concerns that touch all of us in our current day, like our existence in a universe, our tangential nature, and quantum physics' relationship to metaphysical quandaries. He personalizes them to the point of extreme intimacy. Dodge lives and works in Los Angeles, California, which we know is closer to the stars. He has, good, got my joke. He has a prolific career, which I will just give the highlights of. And really, they are truly just the highlights. I'm going to be brief. He's had solo museum exhibitions that include the New Museum, Whitney Biennial, Getty Museum, Hammer Museum, and the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Connecticut, and also solo shows at galleries and venues, including, but not limited to, Joan in Los Angeles, and Calhoun Fine Arts, Grand Armory Collective, and Wall Space in New York. He has also been in numerous significant group exhibitions throughout the US, as well as Vilnius, Lithuania, Bonn and Karlsruhe, Germany, and London, England. In the 90s, he was one of the founders and curators for the infamous San Francisco community-based performance space, the Bearded Lady Coffee House. During that time, Dodge wrote, directed, and performed monologue-based performances, including Muddy Little River and From Where I'm Sitting, I Can Only Reach Your Ass. He made a feature film By Hook or By Crook, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2002 and received 5 Best Feature awards at various other film festivals. He performed in the John Waters film Cecil B. Demented, and in 2008 to 2004, he collaborated with the artist Stanya Khan in many video works while maintaining his own rigorous practice. And he's a recipient of a 2017 Guggenheim Fellowship. Please let us welcome Harry Dodge.
Hi, everybody. How's the sound? Okay? Thank you, Rebecca. That was a nice intro, and thanks for inviting me. It's fun. It's been fun being here, and the studio visits have been great, and everybody I've met so far has just been so tender and lovely and forthcoming, and I really appreciate it. It's been really fun. What am I going to do? I'm going to do this talk, and I've decided sometimes I do the talk with no visuals, and then I sort of flip through the slides really fast at the end, because I like talking, and I know it's hard to concentrate on what I'm saying if there's visuals going, but I just thought, I'm in this art school with this group of sculptors, and I'm just going to play some pictures of my sculptures in the background. But I'm going to have them on real slow, like 20 seconds, so that it seems like it might end up being a little boring, kind of like visually, but just try and listen to me, and then every once in a while look over at the sculptures. It'll be a lot. It feels like it'll be a lot. But I heard you guys like a lot. Profusion, yes. Okay, so I'm not really good with tech, but here, I don't have to do much, but I have to do it now. I'm going to play. All right. So, some of this is taken from a talk I gave recently. So, if people are watching on YouTube and they are like avid, they'll hear some repetition. Anyway, so for this, I'm going to start with a few quotations from Edward Glissant's Poetics of Relation, which is my favorite book, and I teach from it a lot. And every time I read it, I get something new from it. There's just a lot there. It's a difficult book, a challenging text, as I like to say, and but there's a lot that's super inspiring for me, and so I'll just read a few quotations. From early in the book, quote, "The power to experience the shock of elsewhere is what distinguishes the poet. Diversity, the quantifiable totality of every possible difference, is the motor driving universal energy. And it must be safeguarded from assimilations, from fashions passively accepted as the norm, and from standardized customs," unquote. Late in the book, here's another quote. This comes after he's sort of listing questions, basically about tracking all of the ways cultures and peoples have affected one another over time. He says, quote, "Let us try to calculate the results of all that. We will be incapable of doing so. Our experience of this confluence will forever be only one part of its totality. No matter how many studies and references we accumulate, though it's our profession to carry out such things, we will never reach the end of such a volume. Knowing this in advance makes it possible for us to dwell there. Not knowing this totality is not a weakness. Not wanting to know it certainly is. Consequently, we imagine it through a poetics. The imaginary realm provides the full sense of these always decisive differentiations." Here's another short quote from toward the end of the book. "The opaque is not the obscure, though it's possible for it to be so and be accepted as such. The opaque is that which cannot be reduced." And the last quote that I'll read, "Relation is only universal through the absolute and specific quantity of its particularities." These quotations read together start to give you a sense of Glissant's interest in the idea that, and this is very simply stated, change is constant, and that not only are people in relation, but everything is in relation, always changing, affecting, and being affected on a personal scale and a cosmic scale. Glissant uses the word totality with a small t and describes it as a sort of pulsating ball of difference. Again, diversity, quote, "Diversity, the quantifiable totality of every possible difference, is the motor driving universal energy," unquote. And even though the word totality arguably connotes oneness, which in turn arguably connotes sameness or homogeneity, right? He reminds us that his totality, Glissantian totality, is made up of differences, an always changing, always sensitive cosmic flow of relation and proliferating difference. So there's a lot of ideas here, an exhortation away from polarization, away from category, the general, an exhortation away from evaluation of purity, away from static forms of thinking identity, and what he suggests instead is acknowledging contingency, flux, and specificity. In its strong form, the specific is so particular, so filigreed, that to think it or perform it, we enter the space of poetics, which I also think of as irreducible, singular, and associated with an experience of non-mastery or alternate knowings. But here are some questions. Can we think interconnection and also keep difference? Can we think flow without linking it to or also inviting approximation? Can we think difference without separability? So a lot of problems, very lovely problems. So I'm going to circle back around to these ideas, my biting questions, maybe you could call it study, which is a huge part of my practice. But first, a little bit of an overview. And Rebecca went through some of this, and I guess I didn't realize that would happen, but so I'll just slam through some of this. I'm a writer and a visual artist, and that includes sculpture, drawing, video, and I used to perform too, these sort of evening-length multimedia monologue shows that layered in dance, film, live music, complex lighting, and sound cues. I've also made a feature film. And those things, the book, the shows, and the film, there's a durational element that they share, where I'm forced to organize time with projects that are a challenge to hold in my head all at once. I'm possessed by a few biting questions, which activate a related web of even more confusing questions. I'm always moving toward questions. I definitely use intense bewilderment as fuel for practice. I read every day before and after studio work. This pleasure is one thread of what I call the erotics of my practice. I also heed physicalized desires, libidinal urges, during moments of making and while choosing materials. What do I want to touch today? But I don't understand these zones, libidinal, as distinct from the theoretical interests, intellectual. Which is to say, I think of both these pleasures as imbricated and therefore mutually generating. Often in this fashion, bodily saturation with erotic pleasures via extended bouts of thinking. Structures I've been researching will in some way or another show up in the work. At least that's part of the experimental frameworks I'm interacting with. For example, I have stated interests, right? Ideas I'm conscious of, or almost so, miasmic. But I believe my organism's cells are at least 3 steps ahead of the language. And note, I'm educating those cells in every moment of any physical activity, but also by reading or activities usually considered to be exclusively mental. Part of the action of my practice in making is letting the body's intelligences think or manifest via objects. In just this way, I can learn what my interests are, ask myself new questions, crack open misalignments, i.e. grow. And this is different than intuition, which is a word I avoid. This is an idea about educated particles. Around 92 or 93, I founded and ran a queer-centric coffee house and performance space, though everyone was welcome. And it was there and through that experience that I learned what community, laughter, love, and collaboration can add to a life. And it's a lot. I recommend it. Open a space. Figure it out. You won't be sorry. I laughed more in those few years than the rest of my life combined. We put art on the walls, did weird performance nights, sold t-shirts really to stay afloat. And after about 5 years of doing that, my buddy and I were trying to figure out what we're going to do when we grow up, for money. And it was like the dawn of indie film. Kevin Smith had just made Clerks. And so we decided to make a movie and turn ourselves into basically Hollywood film directors. That was how we were going to make dollars. That was our plan. Long story short, it was basically the most laborious thing I've ever done, other than taking care of a newborn, which is 15 times harder. And it took years of nose to the grindstone work, and it was finished. It went to Sundance. We got a distributor. It played for a week in a movie theater, which was one of my goals. And for years on the Sundance Channel, and it got a bunch of awards at film festivals. There you go. But frankly, I didn't like Sundance. I didn't enjoy the little I experienced and saw of the entertainment industry. And honestly, I'm pretty much not interested in conventional feature films. The bases that you have to run there and the onus placed on legibility there, that imperative. So I decided to go to art school. My idea with becoming an artist was sort of a gift to myself. Ideally, I'd get up every morning and do exactly the weirdest, oddest thing, exactly what I wanted to do, and not make product, And so there was this idea that whatever would happen, I'd have spent my life having incredibly interesting days. Sort of no risk, no risk of regrets. And when I got to grad school, I went to Bard, MFA. I had no actual contemporary art or art world background, but a lot of fever, and even then a love of objects and materials. And this is where I discovered theory. It took me years to understand what I was reading, but I kept reading, and all of these weird words, these interlocking histories started to accrue. Honestly, it may have just been easier to have gotten an undergrad education, but I was pretty feral in those days. I sort of still am, but anyway, I was pretty feral in those days, and thought about colleges as a place of domestication by convention. It's a little paranoid. It was at Bard that I started making sculpture, drawing, and art video, and my practice still revolves around those axes, those modes of making. Except now, I write more. And since I know a share of you have read the book, My Meteorite, and are interested in it, I'll take you some of how that book evolved in relation to my broader practice. So last year, just as the pandemic shut everything down, my book was published. And some background on that: the book's called My Meteorite, or Without the Random, There Can Be No New Thing. And here's a little copy from the cover. It's basically an investigation into bonding and how we are shaped by forces we can't fully know. A reckoning with the vital forces of matter, the nature of consciousness, and the bafflements of belonging. The book is loosely structured around a series of coincidences in my life, most of which have to do with my birth family, who I discovered in 2003. I braid a few other narrative strands, including my dad's decline and death from dementia, with bits of my thinking and research on machine intelligence, sort of all during the time when I'm making work for a show and conducting studio visits. I've self-described as a matter enthusiast, and the book describes a couple of years of my study therein, fresh questions about matter as they arose in me. What is the nature of its agency, its habits? What happens if I pressure these relatively minor proposals, extrapolate, for example, if reality is only material, no spirit, no special animating soul sauce, and if it's fabric, all interconnected, how do those things work then on a human scale in terms of daily living? Also important, the book is in large part a performance of thinking, a narrative of thinking, which is to say the bad thought, as I like to call them, the bad thought explained, and then, and in context, how I, the character of the author, go about making new, more relevant questions, the way subsequent thoughts both emerge from and enmesh with my days. All right, so I'll start by telling you that there are, relatively speaking, very few things in this world that can be accurately measured, at least very few things of interest to me. But before I say more on this, I think it'll be helpful to lay down a little initiatory framework, and apropos of that, I'll touch on 4 quick references or ideas, I guess. Well, 3 are quick and one's like medium. So the first thing I want to tell you about is this wonderful, dreamy essay film called 15 Experiments on Peripheral Vision, a short work by filmmaker Adele Horn, former colleague of mine. You know Adele? A former colleague of mine at CalArts. So early on in this piece, she invites, it's about peripheral vision. It literally is 15 experiments in peripheral. Early on in the piece, she invites viewers to hold the thumb up at arm's length from their faces. We're told to observe that what's actually in focus when we encounter the world is just that big, just the width of your thumb held at arm's length from your face. That's what's in focus. This central thumb-sized dot. And she wonders, where then does peripheral vision actually begin and end? Later on in the film, she reports the little-known fact that some very faint stars can only be seen by our peripheral vision. To see them, we must look away. Related to this is the idea of peripheral thought. Generally speaking, it's difficult to comprehend the transitive aspects of a situation as the substance of it, or substance of any sort. We tend to think in stases. William James, in a chapter called Stream of Thoughts, suggests that consciousness alights, which is like a bird alights, which is to say that certain thoughts arrive to us consciously, a kind of stasis. But he suggests that valuable thinking, transitive thinking, the bulk of thinking is unconscious, a never-ending stream, and it goes on betwixt all of the more fixed thoughts we're conscious of. And now some bones onto that. In a book called A Sketch of the Past, Virginia Woolf writes about something she supposes might be called a philosophy. She says, quote, "At any rate, it is a constant idea of mine that behind the cotton wool is hidden a pattern, that we, I mean all human beings, are connected with this, that the whole world is a work of art, that we are parts of the work of art," unquote. So with this, as I understand it, she's describing a hunch or a sense, a knowing, that is also a wager. And right at this moment, I'm less interested in her characterization of it as a cosmically scaled work of art, which drops open questions about authorship, at least to me. But what I am interested in is the cotton wool, a palpable, and the behindness, which is a condition or orientation that can also be thought of as depth or parallelness, occultedness, or even one sense of the word abstraction. And then there's this patternicity, this hidden pattern. And there's also her profound sense of interconnection. And now one last anecdote, which maybe joins all of the above into a slanted circuit. This is an excerpt from a 2013 pamphlet of mine, this kind of extended lyric essay in pamphlet form, called River of the Mother of God, version 2. And this section in the pamphlet relies heavily on James Gleick's book, which is entitled Chaos Making a New Science. Until the late 1970s, physicists, scientists had primarily, when conducting a series of experiments, looked for order, which meant conventionally repeatability. Of course, since most of the natural world is a kind of consumptive open system, hacking up gobs of nonlinear turbulence, this limited purview for science was a kind of core dysfunction. Stanislaw Ulam once said, quote, "Using a term like nonlinear science is like referring to the bulk of zoology as the study of non-elephant animals," unquote. A belief in determinism had carried the day for centuries, but simultaneously, almost paradoxically, so had the truism that measurements can never be perfect. This disjunct or dogleg had been vibrating at the core of science for so long that it had become a sort of dead spot, or maybe like a mousetrap you learn to step over without thinking. At any rate, the prevailing thought went like this: if you had approximate knowledge of a system's initial conditions and an understanding of natural law, you could calculate the approximate behavior of the system. As one theoretician liked to tell his students, the basic idea of Western science is that you don't have to take into account the falling of a leaf on some planet in another galaxy when you're trying to account for the motion of a billiard ball on a pool table on Earth. Very small influences can be neglected. Through the 1950s, this guy, Edward Lorenz, a mathematically oriented meteorologist, that's someone who studies weather, he developed a proto-computer, a machine he called the Royal McBee, which is so cool, isn't it? The Royal McBee, which was able to continually process about a dozen variables that had been designed to represent weather-like forces, relations between air temperature, pressure, variations in pressure related to wind speed, etc. Forecasting weather, then as now, was basically impossible beyond a couple of days, but the Royal McBee was producing strange, messy bits of order, cycles that were recognizable as such, and so they were interesting to Lorenz, but they never happened the same way twice. Regardless, he sensed but wasn't sure that he was noticing an orderly disorder. One day in 1961, as James Gleick tells it, Lorenz wanted to investigate, quote, a sequence at greater length and took a shortcut. Instead of starting the whole run over, he started midway through. To give the machine its initial conditions, he typed the numbers straight from the earlier printout, and then he walked down the hall to get away from the noise and drink a cup of coffee. When he returned an hour later, he saw something unexpected, something that planted a seed for a new science. This new run should have exactly duplicated the old. Lorenz had copied the number into the machine himself. The program had not changed, yet as he stared at the new printout, Lorenz saw his weather diverging so rapidly from the pattern of the last run that within just a few months, all resemblance had disappeared. He might as well have chosen two random weathers out of a hat. His first thought was that another vacuum tube had gone bad, and suddenly he realized the truth. There had been no malfunction. The problem lay in the numbers he had typed. In the computer's memory, 6 decimal places were stored, 506, 127. On the printout, to save space, just 3 appeared, 506. Lorenz, is 0.506. Lorenz had entered the shorter, rounded off numbers, assuming that the difference, 1 part in 1,000, was inconsequential, unquote. In a deterministic universe, approximately the same starting conditions would yield approximately the same results. But, Gleick explains, this was different. In Lorenz's particular system of equations, these tiny deviations had proved cataclysmic. The results in this case had been profoundly sensitive to what is referred to as initial conditions. Lorenz apprehended something here, something that simply didn't fit with the scientific status quo. So that at that point, he began working on ways to understand flow in all kinds of fluids. And the wildest thing here is that he didn't just drop a wet blanket onto the scientific community. Hey, sorry, the world's just a muck of randomness and unpredictability. Instead, he actually saw a kind of order in aperiodicity, quote, a fine geometrical structure, order masquerading as randomness, unquote. Sure, obviously, a chain of events can have a particular odd point of crisis that might magnify small changes, but as Gleick writes, chaos meant that such points were everywhere. They were pervasive. Sensitive dependence on initial conditions was an inescapable consequence of the way small scales intertwined with large. Now, as you may know, eventually scientists have been able to see structure of flow relationships, a rhyming of fractal and chaotic harmonies in everything from stock market fluctuations over decades to leaf edges, the shape of tides, snowflakes, wood grain, bird feathers, and a pot of boiling water. What had seemed random or turbulent was not exactly that. It was aperiodic. There was a kind of order. And it was also hard to detect, especially if you were set on rounding crap off, sloughing a couple of decimal points everywhere you go. Since I read it, this story has served for me as a reminder that heeding and seeking nuance, specificity, faceting, a kind of non-polemical complexity, can keep me closer to structures that are not readily visible, other, or additional matrices, forces, possibly patterns, or even cosmic mores, which is what I said about coincidences recently. I think of my practice as that working at that. Not always toward pattern, per se, which would suggest some final truth. I'm averse to that. But toward an otherwise hidden turbulence that matters. And when I use the word practice, I suppose I mean practicing like tennis practice, as in like what an athlete does. Whatever it is I'm up to, I'm going at it every day. And you know, at this point I've been going at it every day for a long time, and there's something else I want to say, and that's about habit. Now, habit's a weird word used in different fields with different meanings. Rocks have habits, for example, and in this context, the word is used to describe how a rock breaks, how it likes to break. Félix Revesson, in his book Of Habit, written in 1838, revalues the word, the thing in humans, by suggesting that habit is not a kind of grim, machinic, degraded condition or lapse in cognition, and therefore possessed of a depressed socio-ethical gravitas, but rather a valuable category of thinking that the body assumes often as the fruit of repetition. I bring this up as a kind of resonant frame for a discussion of methodology. I assume artists and writers are alike in this, working from bewilderment, being gripped by questions. But as I understand it, one has to learn to find one's questions. And then one must find them every morning, like your glasses or some medicine. And then one learns to spend every day hammering away at them, or whatever the verb, sketching and then parsing. Oh, that's not the thought, this is the thought. And that can happen in language, movement, or in the manipulation of materials. You build, follow sense like a bloodhound, you buzz, you contemplate. Contemplation is all libido in my experience of it. What I'm trying to say is by practicing, you eventually learn to let your questions crack you open while you're cracking them open. And once you're there, once you can do that, I think with few exceptions, an artist doesn't forget how to practice. It's sweaty, erotic, mind-bending labor practicing is, but we learn how to do it, each in our way, and after decades, that knowledge is deep, body-mind deep. Process is a griefy joy and a kind of fever. You practice, one practices, I practice. I find pleasure in allowing novel forms to emerge entwined with novel content. I'm not going to make the same piece twice, or practice with the same questions in the same way twice. Since things are always tangibly or intangibly changing, since we're always and already permeated by one another and the environment, which includes all forces, beings, and things, a co-constituting that is never finished and never stops, such a thing would be technically impossible, going the same way twice. But some of these modes, the fever there might remain relatively constant, that sensitivity, a propensity to dissonance, to non-categorical thinking, to non-teleological thinking, a practice of allowing oneself to be riven with an intense pull toward specificity, disambiguation, which is a kind of work, can lead to places charged and furious with indeterminacy. Non-mastery, uncertainty even enter the picture. There's something voluptuous there. I mean, and this is likely true for most artists, I mean, almost by definition, we're experimentalists. Hopefully I'm finding my way around questions and thoughts that are arriving fresh and confusing every single day. With my Meteorite, I wanted to make a book that I myself would like to read, and I really don't like anything too straightforward. I was not thinking about genre, and though I love breaking rules, I really do, I was not really thinking about breaking rules. Over decades, I guess, especially with regard to art and writing, I've sort of trained myself away from fighting with categories. Mostly now I just sort of forget to remember them. Anyway, for what it's worth, I was just trying to stay exactly on top of my best, weirdest thought. As I see it, my Meteorite is like a large-scale sculpture. It takes 18 hours or something to see it all, but if you don't look at everything, it's not going to add up. Like a long poem, it accrues, and by that action becomes itself. So I guess this is the moment where I tell you that my mind works like a wave machine, Just when I'm trying to disambiguate a certain thought or a proposal, waves of related items surge and overtake the thing I was going to say, that edible piece, that fragment, that social thing I was going to share. But not only that, it seems key suddenly that I deliver that thing that was going to be a fragment with all of the other items that somewhere in me I know are connected or causal, or more importantly, part of the thought. Specificities that will facet it, so to speak, make it not general, approximate, and untrue in some way. And this profusion of other stuff, or so I always believe, will need to be also apprehended. Penumbral, umbral, affective, hard to take in, a kind of hot, pointy, ultra-specific indeterminacy that will save me, save our communication, make us known to one another. This rigor, as I conceive of it, I tell myself it will enable connection, or maybe I should say more authentic connection. Which brings me, however obliquely, to the issue of biography. And I do have something to say on that account. First, I'll tell you that with few exceptions, I like to read things, like I said, that are above my pay grade. That is, I like to struggle some with the text. I enjoy work which I suppose might be considered to be difficult, lyric, and leaping. This has always been true for me, or at least since this really clear moment when I was maybe 15. I was reading some poetry, may have been Emily Dickinson, although Rumi and Virginia Woolf all came to me similarly around this time. I didn't have the words for it then, the why of it, but I have a very clear visual memory of the room I was in. It was a classroom with shiny beige tile flooring, and the girl I was in love with a few feet away at another desk reading a love note from her then boyfriend, who was also a friend of mine. I had introduced them. How stupid. When the question arose in me, something I'm still trying to answer, why do I love this so much, these poems, way more than stories? And I have a clear memory in my body of looking down at the page, trying to figure out why the energy in this was a 1,000 times more explosive and intriguing than what had come before, this plodding narrative prose as I was then suddenly thinking of it. And I remember a sense that it had to do with space, that is, with not labeling, not trying to come down right on the head of something. It had to do with a kind of singularity or specificity, and it had to do with all of that kick, the unspoken, tingly effulgence that the text generated, suggested, or made happen. I do believe it was then that my interest in affect, indeterminacy, the space between things, as I used to call it, which is admittedly a misidentification in this example. Anyway, I do believe this is where it began. But there was something else, too, now that I think of it. Another point of inception. One day, I'm hazarding here, it was the beginning of high school, we'd been assigned a research paper, told to find news clippings. The librarian directed me to this massive compendium of black binders that as soon as she had pointed them out were unmissable. There were probably 200 of them all in a row, all on the top shelves of these stacks against the wall, this sort of unending black row of binders spanning many shelving units, making a structure unto themselves, this line. I walked along the row and scanned them and realized each had a label, a theme or a purported subject matter. For example, oceans or plant life or music or computers or medicine. When I got toward the end of the line, I noticed a binder that said women. And then I noticed another one that said the same, and another one. 3 binders for women, a coup, awesome. And then I walked back and looked for how many of them said men, and there were none. And then I remember thinking, those women binders are a problem. I was a kid, so I thought, until we get rid of those binders, we will not be considered to be equal. I thought of stealing them, burning them, putting them in the fucking garbage can, and I remember this titillating conundrum came up fast and filled me, a paradox. I thought, but if we get rid of them now, it would be too soon. It seemed the binders were a necessary part of a process. Too soon, I remember thinking. You can't get rid of them too soon. I suppose my thought then was twofold. There's no clear line as to what qualifies creatures as men and women. Those categories, their definitions, are illusory and fundamentally serve to make a patriarchy possible. I didn't think that in those words, obviously. But also, there may have to be a painful interim period of strategic alliance afforded by the use of those categories that had been generated by the oppressor, some period of use long enough to cohere an effective overthrow of the system. I still think about these binders, the hard plastic-coated cardboard containers, the long row of them. I remember thinking how many there were. It was impressive, even overwhelming, and also so few when you think about it. A whole world out there, and someone made this stupid row of binders. The tension that arose in me that day, the vibration of disharmony or paradox, these things near each other, the amplitude of the bothness was riveting. Here, Two things were true, but they crashed into each other. The ecstasy caused by this feeling of dissonance was unforgettable, and an urge to it remains alive in me. And I guess I also still wonder, what do we gain and what do we miss by this ordering we do by category? This basically constant use of resemblance and similitude in daily life as a primary ordering force. And I know it's arguably physiological, and that it's a huge slice of intelligence, or at least the inchoate combustible momentum that generates intelligence, but still. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting, well, there's no difference between, this and that and that and that. I'm not suggesting homogeneity or even hazy approximation as the alternative to category. A sort of annihilation of difference toward a shiny gray, wholly undifferentiated blob of unity, an urge which can, uninterrogated, become a kind of fascist urge, and there's more to say about that. But what I'm suggesting is that the alternative to category is specificity. Philosopher Rosie Braidotti, in her theorization of what she calls the plural subject, stresses that even within a context of interconnectedness, or the plural subject she's theorizing, even within a context of interconnectedness, the plural subject she's theorizing is, she calls it, quote, embodied and embedded, unquote, which is to say that we are specific, each unique. But even if this notion or this approach to the world is actually more ethical, kind, generous, or just plain old more true, to encounter the world in this way, absolutely, as a rule, a doctrine, is difficult or maybe even impossible. Roland Barthes says that even if a thing seems to be the same as another thing, treat it as if it were different. But where does this exhortation begin and end? And how do we take it on, wear it, on a daily human scale? But here's the question phrased differently. This urge to examine, to see, to grab, to touch the world with my mind, to be in, encounter, to know more, what are some ways it can work? Right off the bat here, we must acknowledge that different modes will work best for different people at different times with different goals. And second, we should also acknowledge that sometimes the urge to know and the subsequent knowing will take place largely in language. That is where most of us have been taught to consciously register our knowing or mastery, as the case may be. But along with that, we must also recognize that there are many kinds of knowing, and that those alternative forms have been, largely, depending on who you're talking to, undervalued. Take the binary rational and irrational, for example. Certain of these alternate knowings, precisely because they are deep, are not coalescing into language. They are non-language knowings, and so can be difficult to communicate about. And so this might be a reason why they are undervalued too. We, some of us, prize conversation as encounter, speech as the mediating object, this ropey bridge between us. Making sentences and then offering them as connective tissue is a huge part of encounter, and I get that. By language, I am afforded sociality, at which point it often scarcely matters what I'm saying, only that we're talking, that we desire someone's company. One of the things discourse can do, ecstatically, is augment, knit, or even secrete human sociality. I realize now that I'm equating language with category. And while there's some truth to that concepts do not go fully into their descriptions, and so in the effort to make sentences from thoughts, something is lost, or at least is left in the air nearby. While there's some truth to that, I'm comforted simultaneously by the fact that language does more than fail to represent. Language also always becomes things that are also themselves, manifest things, which is to say, almost like something from nothing, language can push into existence presences, thought objects that were not there before. And by this, I'm often enabled to the ability to see or feel what heretofore I could not. In this case, language is a kind of touching, like little grabby raccoon hands, palpating and cleaning food in the creek at night, feely little hands finding shapes there, making discoveries, but also maybe like magic. Maybe the more you touch, the more you find. And so, borrowing from Edward Glissant here, I think poetics, language-based or otherwise, and I lately use the word poetics as a synonym for art, maybe poetics, feverishly practiced, is a way we can attempt the impossible work of addressing that which is unknowable, or maybe unsayable, or maybe unmasterable. And by the word poetics, I'm not indicating vagueness, in fact, just the opposite. I'm talking about the proliferative filigree of specificity, difference par excellence, the fuel for what Glissant calls relation or totality. Poetics, practiced in this way, doesn't take up ideas that are otherwise clear and then obscure them, but rather produces or introduces something irreducibly singular, something important. Glissant has written, "We demand the right to opacity." But to finish my point, and remember this started with binders, what thoughts can I have about category? Its motley functionality, its violences, its dispensations. Can I finally make a few thoughts about it and then put it down, move on? Am I busying myself with a misprecision on this account? Because I can no more control my use of analogical or categorical thinking or willy-nilly semblance making than I can the rain. But sometimes I wish I could. And these decisions about how to proceed are for me also an admittedly political concern and a daily living concern. In 2007, I had a job interview, my first real shot at a permanent faculty position, which would have placed me in the sculpture department at UCLA. Hold on, I gotta get a drink. During the interview, by way of introduction, there were things I was trying to tell the committee. You know, my new research-based practice included a lot of reading, theory, science, history, etc., and trying to contextualize how new and pleasurable all of that reading felt, all of that textual pursuit, discovery, and analysis. I announced that for the period of time between when I quit undergrad and when I went to grad school, a period of about 15 years, I had conducted a sustained life experiment in which I had, quote-unquote, tried not to think for 15 years. Now, at the job interview, as soon as I said it, I remember being certain that this news would disqualify me. It didn't, but I had thought it would. My memory of that interview fails after this sort of main event, this wash of fear. But let me loop back around. The impulse to not think, which resulted in this years-long experiment, and maybe this is a given, but I think it bears saying here, it had everything to do with the particulars of my biography, including, but not any stretch limited to, the location of our far north Chicago suburb, Midwest, which was in fact the rural suburban threshold marked by Rust Belt-style faltering small industry and pollution, the fact that I'd grown up in what we all called subdivisions, where all the houses looked alike. The streets were new and curved just so, the way those subdivisions had been excised from and were still wholly surrounded by farm fields, meadows, abandoned nurseries, unfinished abandoned freeways. Also the budding agitprop of the early ecology movement in the 70s, which in every case hit me like a ton of bricks. Because we traveled so seldom, and for a million other reasons, I believed that every bit of the surface of the earth had already been ruined beyond repair. People polluting, being shitheads, carving up and administering arbitrary order onto things that are vast and actually uncontainable. It seemed that this celebrated thinking part was overrated. And I thought, whatever it is that nature does, that's what I want to do. And so, landing in San Francisco in 1985, the experiment was, yes, to not think as defined by book learning, say. I operated on, I think, an unfortunate misperception linking intellectualism to elitism. Thus, I avoided institutions in particular, their propaganda, the canons there. I resolved to find information from people unmarred by academia. And other than that, I would ideally glean everything from my own flesh somehow, a phrase I oft repeated. For example, as we traveled around the West Coast, hitchhiking or otherwise, we would eschew guidebooks and road maps. We actually drove around without maps toward Oregon, say, and if we saw something that looked like public lands, green trees, a raging river, we would park and walk in and camp. Where were we? I could not tell you. What was around the bend? I did not know and could only imagine. When I was 23, I took a course in furniture and cabinet making. The teacher introduced us one by one to a room of hand tools. He had these beautiful calipers, slender little long-fingered tendrils. He told us that we should, when possible, use calipers because measurement was inaccurate. It was always an approximation, and the inaccuracy would only grow as we translated it ruler to ruler, marked it with a pencil, etc. And the thing that sticks in my head even now is that he would press these little skinny arms around the stub end of a piece of wood, and he would tighten it, and then he'd say, "How big is it?" "It's this big," and hold up the calipers. You would see the space there, and it would be full of information that had no words at all. It seemed to me that that information was somehow unpinned by index or translation, atop left spinning. Could we have gone farther and seen more if we'd had a map or any information on the land? Yes. Undoubtedly, something was seeded in the deal. But I've come to think of it in terms of what was manifest during those years. Briefly, among other things, it was a practice in orders of knowledge and somatic learning, this commitment to directness, thrumming nowness, a practice of initiating yes, which is to say I developed a habit of being sensitized to the possibilities of the moment at hand. I was learning. I ran a space, organized shows, and that time was full with art, activism, so much love in a community marked by sharp wit and fierce intelligence, and honestly, like I said, more laughter more constantly than I have ever experienced since. How long's that been going on? What? 10 or 12 minutes? It's probably nice to have a break. I'll play it again. Could we have gone farther and seen, in my view, the ideas, as artists anyway, the ideas and questions we entertain, our undertakings, always have a connection to a body, a particular consciousness, some ultra-specific biography. A philosopher, author, thinker, or artist may not mention or try to pin down the unquantifiable reasons a particular question has arrived in their field of vision, but this choice in no way changes the fact. All theory starts somewhere, on the ground, in a life. Everyone builds from the ground. And the thing is, I like to assign causes, create little nets of cause and effect, and it's a comfort, no doubt. And I'm not going to say there's no cause and effect, but I have to remind myself that because the world is an untrackable open system, I'm not actually able to know what has caused what. My assignations, which by definition are approximate, must therefore be something to hold lightly, lest they function to oversimplify a reading when I'm looking at someone's artwork, especially when I think I know something about someone, about their biography, and then start making assumptions. One more thing on that. As a maker, particularly with projects, why is that not working? Does she know? Do I know? Huh? Oh, it doesn't want to play again and again. Okay. Got it. I'll just start it again. Say what?
You can take off the timer and just keep it on the last slide.
Sure, yeah.
So, normal view, or play the slideshow. There we go. And then just,
That'll stay.
yeah,
We can look at Night Goat for a while.
and touch the touchpad every now and then, and you'll be fine.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate it. One more thing on that. As a maker, particularly with projects that are considered to be nonfiction, there's a possibility of including things like Brechtian interventions into an aura of facticity. I like to do that, add reminders that, well, this thing you're holding, it's not a representation, it's a new thing. So, about method, I've always believed in the magic of allowing my largest points or messages or even storylines to be generated in the energy and affect of the unsaid, which is to say the territory between and around what is said or shown is actually the star of the show. So I'm inscribing, but I'm not drawing a thing, a figure. I'm working in the field, etching resonant things around it. And the gambit is that a shape or a fullness emerges in the space of what I have not touched directly. After grad school, I sunk into my research, knocking my head against these difficult texts, worked on sculpture and video making. One of the primary catalysts for my reading during this period, 2005-ish, was my theory that everything in the world is actually made out of the same one elementary particle, a postulation that, had it been true, would have meant that every perceived difference, shape, or edge was simply the result of variations in arrangement and or density, a kind of material syntax. So no edges really technically existed, thus everything, the world, the universe, was one thing. And though I searched for a long time, hunched over books, hunched over my laptop, I found almost no evidence to support this notion. I kept running into difference and diversity, which at that moment means I was finding a lot of information about ecosystem, open systems. I was in the middle of trying to make sense of the idea of difference, take it on board. How would it interact with this impression I had of being connected to everything else, that everything was permeated with everything else? And I just come up with this idea of thresholds that have dimension, dimensional thresholds contaminated by elseness, which preserve the idea of difference without adding back in the idea of hard edges. And I had this image of coagulated specificities floating in a field of everythingness. And then in 2013, I made this pamphlet, as I've mentioned, called River of the Mother of God, V2. And this is how it happened. I'd been making sculpture and video for a while, exhibiting my work, but something was off for me. I knew the artwork provided something singular, an experience, and I had believed that that thing was social, among other things, that any artwork is certainly a missive from an artist, and by that, some connective tissue, a kind of sociality would be catalyzed, and human connection would automatically follow. But something was off. I was plagued by a kind of loneliness. I started to wonder whether I was correct, that an experience of my work might be easily translated to language and thus sociality. And more precisely, I started to wonder whether it was possible or even desirable for a viewer to glean my questions, the operative questions, from the work. Because after all, these things are separate. I can outright tell you the questions, but grappling with them, undertaking activities suggested by them, is quite a different thing. So, as a kind of experiment in art and sociality, I decided to write out some of my interests, questions, thoughts, and to present that writing in the form of a takeaway pamphlet alongside my video and sculpture during the Made in LA show at the Hammer Museum in 2014. This was, in a sense, the first time I'd undertaken such a thing, nonfiction, more theoretical in tone, weaving first-person stories about my research and making with news of other thinkers, etc. So that was a big turning point, and it was prompted directly from some need I had that the sculpture wasn't fulfilling, which is an interesting point. Around that time, while Maggie wrote The Argonauts, we passed it back and forth, trying to make language in context for a representation of me in the book. Now and again, I urged her to add tons more examples of indeterminacy, believing the portrayal of me, specifically my completely non-representable relationship to what the culture calls gender, would thereby, and should rightly, I thought, be readable as a tiny and fleeting example in a flood of examples of this thing, indeterminacy, examples of the wavelength never collapsing. The thing, indeterminacy, constant flux, would, ideally, as far as I was concerned, describe everyone and everything. By way of response to this appeal, Maggie kept saying, "That's your book," an assertion which I obviously took on board as an invitation, or maybe just a game plan. As I've said, one of the primary characteristics of my practice is literally sitting or walking and thinking hard. I really do experience thinking as a full-body pleasure. And that means collecting things that confuse me, and then burrowing in, trying to disambiguate, check my hunches as proposals or absurd extrapolations. I also teach, which is a pressure and a pleasure. And I teach in much the same way I communicate in artwork, trying to set up points of study, allow for people to build thoughts in the fertile interstices. I mention it here because that calling further reinforces this modality, gathering texts, annotating passages, and tracking the weird phases of a thought and process. I don't read anything without a pencil. This is all to say that in every moment, I'm always already churning with these lovely, desperate turbulences, trying to will myself into the place behind the cotton wool. So, when it comes time to begin making a show or a book, it's fair to say the raw materials are there. In some sense, there is enough to begin. In 2015, the year before I started the book project, and trying to keep my thinking fresh, I was in a full overhaul of my sort of primitive, survivalist, neo-Luddite technophobia. I realize I haven't really described that mindset so briefly. It was like, well, if all electricity and fuel and motors disappeared and everyone was just offline and back to the land, that would be fantastic. And the only thing I would miss is hot water. I'd been reading Rosie Braidotti and Samhito Styril, both of whom I was really enjoying, and it seemed that according to these two, not everything about everything high-tech was sorrowful and tragic. And they also seemed to be allowing for some future, which was to include continuing advances in technology. My plan to go backward technologically had started to strike me as calcified. So I made an exhibition for wall space called The Cybernetic Fold, which you saw pictures of. where I was trying to chew on some of these new questions I had about tech. I was pondering pixels, remoteness, the flatness of the screen. Here were some of my questions. Was there a body behind the flatness? Did flatness itself have a body or any dimension? Was a lack of resolution to be understood as absolutely impoverished? And then, what about higher and higher resolution experiences or objects? Did communication characterized by remoteness have to be synonymous with a kind of sensual aridity or insufficiency? And then, one day welding, for the first time, I suddenly realized that though I'd often associated metals with robots, computers, machinery, the unnatural, unfeeling coldness of industrial capitalism, metals actually come out of the earth. Far from being fundamentally unnatural, metals were comprised of and descended from the same particles as me and everything else. So this is the weird web of things that were in play when researching minerals one day, i.e. shopping for crystals on eBay. I took a weird turn and stumbled into the iron meteorite aisle. When I saw my meteorite, I promptly fell in love. Soon after, it arrived to me by post. One fair morning, my new friend the meteorite told me to write a book. It is no exaggeration to say that this exhortation I heeded at once, walked to my computer, and began writing. Now, because I've never properly written a book, there was some psychological stuff to get through. I told myself and a few other people that I was pretending to write a book, which introduced a kind of pantomime element into the process, and a pretending that helped. I also decided that though I would use materials gleaned from my own experiences, I'd consider the book to be fiction. This was a little schism that made space too. It felt like I broke a rock and then set the two pieces back together. I also immediately decided to simply take notes, as I called it, track things in a messy, absolutely abbreviated form to be truly written or filled out at a later time. And in this way, I could avoid being waylaid by a kind of characteristic oceanic quality that overtakes my hands when I type. I've learned to make holding structures very early in any making process. For example, I'll say, all right, there's going to be 2 videos at so-and-so length, 3 sculptures, 4 drawings, and the structure allows me to begin, though while in process, I remain open to the likelihood that these things will change. And back to this notion of the peripheral, which is crucial, especially in the early phases of a project or an exhibition or a new body of work, and unquestionably so in the initiation of this book. So like I said, certain very faint stars can only be seen in one's peripheral vision. To see them, we must look away. While I practice, I cultivate and am thus saturated by an odd vigilance, a kind of open-heartedness, like antennae that convey what's popping and growing in this proximate, fecund swarm that exists sort of behind me. It's next to me, sending messages, while I busy myself with other things. This is a kind of gambit, and it feels like trying to tame a coyote, or at least have it over to dinner. Instinctively, you know you must busy yourself with the casserole, right? Or at least be facing away from the door, focusing on the stove, cutting things, tasting what's there. You don't want to scare it away, so you're just listening. And maybe you close your eyes, and now you hear whispery footsteps, the creatures breathing. Eventually, close enough, you sense an alacrity. And quietly, this detente becomes an alliance, however short-lived. This dance characterizes well the year-long period of note-taking. Thus, I was attentive to the book as a whole, allowing this practice of obliqueness to generate items that I would devotedly note into the document, which as a rule I did not reread. And we know that inspiration is 99% perspiration, so I continued to jot down brief descriptions of daily events, always at the end of the document. I would sometimes allow myself to add things in a particular order, but I would always go in superstitiously kind of half-lidded, making sure not to hard focus or begin writing in earnest, as I called it. So this was a gathering period of a year. It was also a period of listening to the world and listening to myself in the world, feeling linkages, rhymes related to the book project as I continued to research in just the way I always do. Early on, I made a decision to use instances of current technological innovation as historical markers. Because, of course, that was Trump, and all kinds of stuff was happening in the world, and I wasn't tracking that. I was tracking the technological innovations that were sort of popping in. As I say in the book, technology is nature cultures in time, For example, new modes of surveillance, breakthroughs in machine intelligence, virtual reality advances. A facility opened in 2016 called LIGO that could detect gravitational waves made by the collision and amalgamation of two black holes 20 million centuries ago. Most every invention or thought is built on hundreds of others that have come before. Certain thinkers have even suggested that technology is inevitable, noting the frequency of near-simultaneous breakthroughs by otherwise unrelated people. Existing knowledge sets the table for next steps. It accrues. Along these lines, folks who theorize about whether there is intelligent life on other planets assume that given a starting point for organic life, and given the habits of matter, most civilizations in universes where materials and physics are the same as ours will proceed at a similar clip, including technologically. And I decided to provide forward progression, which people enjoy, by chronologizing the year 2016. And I looked for possible subplots that would be told linearly in such a way that they would provide some urge to resolution, otherwise known as tension. And in creating any of my time-based projects, I always grapple with conventions of durational viewing. Novels, movies, these waves, we've been habituated to long works. The conventions, I'm aware of picking them up and aware of putting them aside. So the day after my dad died, after that year, there was a sharp change in my approach to the manuscript. I sat down and began writing in earnest, and this is where I shifted my practice from being in the studio full-time, by which I mean 25 or 30 hours a week, to writing with just the same application of time and commitment. Now I really focused on being in the document in a more voluptuous frame of mind. I willed myself to address each of the notes thoroughly, use them as fodder for whatever might come. I also decided to add keys or legends, a series of softly instructive, even Brechtian asides or guides that would point back at the book itself. And the shift from notes to writing is pretty distinct for me. There's some other doors in my body that I open, a deep ratification. So now I'm going in hard, affirmatively making sentences, and it's for me an intense, very conscious process. It's important to say here that what appears on the page initially, those ideas are almost entirely bunched up in knots. Thoughts that contain 5 thoughts that will need to be pulled apart, a jumble, just a totally ugly jumble of stuff comes out quickly and fast onto the page, and instead of saying, no, 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 it's bad, I just let it come out. And then later, I go back in and figure out what's there. As a younger writer, I was slow from the start and would hence lose my way. Too myopic, wrong pace for a bigger picture. So section by section, there's an acceleration followed by a deceleration, and in which I read over and start to build something more precise. And this part is very slow. Am I saying what I want to say? I consider grammar, word choice, prosody, accuracy. Are the nouns pointing to what they need to be pointing to? Or are they pointing wrong? And what is the real verb or the actual preposition that should be here? What's the actual dynamic that I'm describing and that I want to be describing? It's writing, but not to finish. It's writing to test. Editing video is for me a similar process, very methodical and thorough, even when I'm not about to finish, sort of testing each part. Thoughts must be teased into existence. The structure and progression of the section is attended to, woven into a form that sings about what it might be when it's completed. So this is where I do trial amplitude runs. It's like testing snow or plaster or egg whites for personality, stickiness, density, potential for amplitude, so that when I come back later, I will know what's possible there almost as soon as I encounter it. After that, I begin reading through the document and start to foster it as a whole, going back into all sections, rewriting with an eye to a finish, pressuring the text with new additional concerns. And with this finer grit sanding, moires appear, like grain in wood or opalescence in a shell that wasn't visible before this step. So that also means responding to that, building off that too. I'm going to skip a little bit here. But just say that I decided to use a fugue structure as well early on, which is a sort of musical compositional term where a phrase gets repeated, but certain instruments drop out and other instruments drop in. Certain harmonic, certain melodic patterns get repeated, but also change a little bit as it goes, and then it winds up at the same spot. So I was doing that with the book. And then I talk about the threads of the book and say in the final phases of making a book or a show, I'm trying to hold everything at once. among other things, I'm aware that a book or an artwork navigates the beginning of a relationship. A certain kind of friendship builds, or intimacy. So even as I resolve to being honest in the offing, there is a pace to consider. Each thread in the book is a figure comprised by other figures, and in entertaining the piece as a whole, I'm making them and weaving them, which is sculptural, but it has sound too. Every new sound will be heard in a wash of what has come before. There's also an architecture of comprehension, the admission of concepts in a particular order, as in geometry proofs, corollaries accruing, and this works differently in sculpture than books or film, right? But sedimentation, duration is there in sculpture, just more of a field or crowd. So always I'm reckoning what's more apparently accessible, in which a sense of mastery or connection is foregrounded, with singular offerings that are indeed only available affectively or as non-language knowings. In the book, these lyric sections are key and can be thought of as corrective, a reminder that the prose and the book are more than a simple sum of parts. And the word lyric here thus includes the lacuna, or leaps, not always white space, those vibrating almost silences, virtual, imaginary, full with after image and muscle ache, full of non-language knowings. This field, in which the turbulence of specificity is not pinned to language per se, to me, contains the real subject matter of the book. What takes place there is becoming, as it were, in the not empty spaces, just next to what is manifest, that knowable thing, in the song of many songs at once, imminent in the field and elsewhere too, but perhaps more fugitive in the figure, and I can explain that later, more fugitive in the figure. That's what I'm most interested in. And what's also included in that, for me, is the reader, the fullness of their encounter with that field, the very diffuse meat that is relation, is love, evidences a will to encounter in general. The fullness of the reader's encounter with the field evidences a will to encounter in general, and it strikes me as daring, the willingness to meet up in non-language knowings, which is, after all, how we are bound to meet up. That inclination or appetite is very moving to me. Thank you. So that was a lot. Do you want to see those sculptures again, or did you get to see them? You got to see them. Yeah, play it again while I'm answering questions, maybe. Yeah, that's a good idea. All right, let's try it. See if I can do that. With my obviously limited tech abilities here. So a little faster, maybe not 20 seconds, maybe a little faster, 10 seconds. I'm not able to change it. Nope. Okay, whatever, 20 seconds it is. All right. Huh? There you go, okay. Questions? All right, go on. I'm not scared.
Hearing you talk about your writing, I was imagining that process is something that you were bringing to how you're making physical objects as well. Should I repeat my question? So my question is, well, hearing about your writing, I was imagining that you're taking that similar type of process to your object making, but it also sounded like you weren't doing that type of writing until more recently. So I'm curious if you think that's true, or how your approach to object making has changed after like that intense period of writing.
I think there's a lot of commonalities in the writing method that I described. I felt like, and I even said that, it's like this is sort of like a lot of that was like a general way of being practiced, just sort of letting my interests guide me, being feverish with reading, kind of educating my particles, and then sort of moving into letting my body move hello, letting my body move around and sort of heating that, yeah. I mean, it's a little different, like especially at the end, you know, and the kind of, there's a kind of, you know how language is kind of authoritative and pointy in a weird way, and we expect different things from it. And so I expect different things from my language or have different sort of goals for it, which isn't to say that we don't get that way when we're trying to finish a sculpture or a video. But yeah, so I think they're more alike in some ways than different, yeah. And I did think of that as like the way, you know, the sculpture sort of, there's stuff attached to it, and there's this there, and there's that there. You know, I definitely felt like the book, you know, I was putting together the book in that same way. The difference in the book is that I'm orchestrating some durational conventions. And so I'm deciding whether I'm going to put this in a linear time or whether I'm not going to heed that convention. And I'm also knowing that it's a long, arduous thing, so I'm going to try and give reasons for a reader to turn pages. I'm interacting with that sense of patience, you know, in a different way. But I do that with video as well. The minute anything gets beyond 4 or 5 minutes, you know, you're like, all right, they're going to walk away, you know. And so, yeah, the longer it is, the more I'm kind of like attuned to it in some way. Yeah. I mean, the thing about the book, it's like putting a found object, like a nameable found object in a sculpture or something, you know, where there's figures, they're nameable figures. And so in the book, people will read a section and they get taken up with whatever that section is saying, you know, and so you run the risk of, well, it's not, I don't know if it's a risk, but you're kind of also trying to orchestrate a sense of like, yeah, this is what you're reading, but also pay attention to the stuff that you're not reading, you know. So there's a risk or something, there's a sort of idea with language that it contains everything, I think. And so how was I to remind you that you're not just reading a book of facts, you know, that there's something else in the song and in the you know, there's something sculptural. There's a way that you would approach an artwork that you could maybe bring to this. So that's like a thing you have to accomplish. Okay, sorry. Oh, you're just a mic holder. In the back.
All right, thank you. I was wondering, what do you think of the relationship between your thinking and the objects in the end? And how do you want the audience to encounter those objects? Like, do you want them to, when they see the object, ultimately they can come to your thinking? And that is more important, or I don't know. Or what if they just see the objects and they don't immediately get to what you go through? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that's my quandary. You know, you've put your finger on it. You know, I'm on one hand committed to these non-language knowings and these sort of like ways we encounter something and have stuff happen, but we're not able to grab onto it, you know, and we don't know if we got it, and there's no certainty and mastery, but letting it be, but not having that be a block, and then continuing to be open while we're in the discomfort of that turbulence and that sort of one-to-one relationship that isn't moving into language, thus mastery, or thus like, I got this, you know. Sorting how to let it deepen enough to be big and specific and deep, not get uncomfortable, but then as an artist, like I said, the trouble for me was that people weren't necessarily, as much as I wanted them to, talking to me about the work. So I was still like in the hallway or at home, and people were rolling by stuff, and you know, I may or may not have been hearing from them. There was still like, there was this intense feverish studio practice, which I was alone, and thinking, gonna call that person back later, or maybe when they see the show, they'll know that I was busy, and then they'll feel like I'm a good friend because I made this cool thing. Now we're, like as if it was a battery for love and devotion that was then gonna release that love back out to loved ones who I'd been neglecting, and that wasn't happening. One, that wasn't happening, and two, just there wasn't enough conversation and community that was kind of like recirculating around the objects, or conversation about my ideas or stuff I wanted to talk about, which has to do with my ideas, but also has to do with your ideas, like let's talk, And so I was thinking, like, what's going on with those sculptures are they blocking discourse? And so that's confusing to me, and I don't know how to answer that question. But I think it's fascinating. And so I did what I knew how to do, which was like try language, which is like how people are used to knitting sociality together. And so that's why I made that pamphlet in 2013. And I put like a little, I made these takeaway pamphlets, and I had just sort of listed my interests. And not that I thought my interests were not to tell you how to read the sculpture, which is why I don't go through the sculptures and say, this is about that, and this is about that, and this is about that. I'm more likely will tell you this, the materials or how I made it or something, but I don't want to necessarily translate it into language. Although I do add fancy titles to stuff. Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, one more question.
Follow up.
So if happenstance or, what is the word you used? Randomness that comes into play, and that's your process, then how do you know when the work is ready, is done, or when should you stop, or if, I kind of go through the same process now, but is it like really then everything works? Like
No, because it's not random. Because it's specific, and it's not accidental. It's like a lot of intent, and so the idea anyway, the gambit, the experiment is, if I'm feverishly addressing something and getting it to be the way I want it to be, and it hits a spot where I think, yes, that's what I want it to be, and I'm behind it, then that's when it's done, But I'm assuming that that's not random, that it has to do with something in me that knows what I want it to do or something, even if it's not happening in language. So it's not random. It's the idea is anyway that it's very specific, and that specific, irreducible thing that's not translatable to language goes out into the world as like a missive about that thing. And so, yeah. Does that answer your question? No,
Kind of,
about when a
kind of.
work is done?
kind of, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's a feeling I have,
Yeah.
which and basically goes like this: this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this doesn't suck.
All right, thank you.
This is okay. It's like a miracle, right? Yeah, that's how that feels.
The mic. First of all, thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming. This is kind of a two-part, and one I feel like is a really practical, easy question, or maybe not easy, but a straightforward question. And another one I think is more responding to the talk as a whole. I've heard you use this term thought object a lot, and I find that really interesting because it seems like you believe that immaterial things do have this sort of like matter to them or this sort of material presence in one way, and yet this idea of a thought object seems like it can't be material. So it's like this, I imagine it as this kind of like dark matter of sorts. So I don't know if that's more of like a comment or a question, but I'd like to hear a little bit more of how you think of that. And then the other part of it, which is kind of a hard pivot, but like in your practice, in the sculptural work, it seems like there's a lot of fastness happening, a lot of quickness. And so I'd wonder if you could speak to the parts of it that feel slow for you.
Sure. The first question first. I have been in a long, like a thought experiment about being a materialist, like trying to think of nothing as immaterial and everything is material. Everything is matter. And so this idea of like no soul, basically nothing. The thought experiment is like, what happens if I just try to live life thinking of everything as material, basically. And not like raw material for my sculptures, not like instrumentally, but just like to value matter as like a thing that accounts for everything, you know, including thoughts and everything. And that's been sort of decades long, and in some ways that sort of stemmed from like a sort of a kind of simple thing I learned when I was young about Christianity, sort of like moving into sort of pagan places or places that had other kinds of religions that were more earth-based or body-based or something, you know, and where humans had more of a feeling that they were somehow continuous with the earth or different their surroundings more in continuity, and sort of creating the schism where heaven was up there and it was clean and bodies were dirty and all your desires were dirty and all, you know, just sort of like making this binary, which effectively, you know, disempowered any sort of power or that people were getting between them and their environment, basically. And women also, you know, as kind of misogynist parallel, like women being more connected with this dirty thing that was nature, and men being this rational being. So sort of all this kind of like very basic stuff that I learned after I got to San Francisco, and it just made me want to do the opposite, basically, which was like value matter and pretend that everything was matter. And so I've just been doing that for decades and decades and decades. But it's led me to some really interesting places. Now you couldn't convince me otherwise. You know, it's like it's in me. And of late, I've thought of like virtuality, you know, this idea of the virtual, just the word virtual, which first we connect with virtual reality and kind of digital spaces. But the word has other meanings, and they're all really, really interesting. And so this idea of the virtual, Donna Haraway says the virtual is not immaterial. It could be just as simple as anything that's in the digital realm is actually just being produced by energy that's burning, and you know, it's there, and thoughts. Again, you know, not to get too humdrum about it, but you know, this idea that thoughts are weird things that are being generated by electric currents in our brain and stuff, like that's all like sort of happening, you know. So it can be very sort of banal in some sense, you know, too. But lately I've been thinking about the virtual and this idea of the imaginary, you know, with the capital I, and thinking as a sort of weird little group that sort of hit the same. They're sort of like synonymous for me at the moment. And then it sort of links in with a kind of aspirational point of this idea of imaginary worlds or world building, and thinking as action, because the binary between action and thinking, I think, is really odd, as if you must do in order to have done something, you know. So I'm kind of interested in revaluing thinking as an act and an action, and getting rid of the binary between thinking and acting as well. Also interested in the idea that thinking changes your thought structure, so it creates another thought, which creates another thought. So thinking changes things, and sort of writ large, wondering how thinking changes things, not convinced that it doesn't. So that's that question. And then the slow parts, there are a lot of slow parts, but I really like an urgent line, it's true. And some of it takes a long time, that took 2 weeks of 8 hours a day, but it's like every once in a while I am trying to think of where some of the slow parts are. It's not moving anymore. But sometimes, I'm sanding. I was telling someone today, like, I like to think of the slow parts as grandpa perfect. Like grandpa's in the garage making something nice. You know, that's my slow part.
Sorry, maybe I can clarify, but like, I think process and slowness are understood for sure.
Okay.
Like, there's aspects of making that require a certain degree of tedium.
Yeah.
But I think I'm trying to get at a more sort of metaphysical or theoretical slowness, like where you feel slow with the object. Like, where does that come in your studio practice when you're making these objects? I mean, perhaps I'm just gonna kind of guess here a little bit. Is it coming more from that research, that really rigorous research, or would you say that kind of falls into tedium as well? I don't know if I'm making the distinction very clear.
I'm trying to think of where I might feel slow or be slow as opposed to fast. And I'm just wondering if those modalities don't occur to me. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not aware of slowness and fastness necessarily. I'm kind of aware of, like, excitement and not excitement, or I'm aware of trying. I really like trying for some reason. And I like trying really hard at thinking, and I like trying really hard at making things. I especially like trying really hard at thinking. I just find it a real pleasure. And so that might be slow, but because I find it a pleasure, I'm more aware of something else. I'm not aware of speed. Where speed comes in for me, and where I'm thinking, where speed seems relevant to me as a kind of pressure is in line quality for some reason. I sometimes think about urgent making, but things do slow down, like where this person up here was talking about, where you get confused and stuff starts to seem arbitrary. In those moments, I can feel them. I'm like, well, should I put this one, this one? You know, and in those moments when stuff I kind of get a little lost, I do go back. I take a break and I go back and see, what is it I'm interested in? Or I think, what are you interested in? Not which is going to look better or what should it be, but what are you interested in? So hopefully bringing those theoretical urges to the fore then suddenly in a work that's not necessarily all about language, that's where language hits it. Sometimes it answers those questions where it brings me back out of the arbitrary, or back where my fever stops and peters out. Then I bring the consciousness back in, and I sort of dance with those two things.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm very curious how you're able to maintain being so untethered, and like I feel like in your practice it's evident because you're involved, but also just in life I feel like in avoiding like force and needing to explain through language and needing to like always understand like separate identifications in a limiting way. And I'm just wondering how that affects like day-to-day life for you, or practice, how you maintain it, how like you don't get bogged down by needing to explain.
I do need to explain. Need to explain. But, and it's like weird. That's what I was saying at the beginning. Like, I'll be about to say something, and I'll be like, oh, but this is also, and oh, and yeah. And so it's just tons of like fear and urgency about getting this thing said, but it's like I'll never get it said because it has so many parts,
Impossible.
And so that is like, it's like a lot of urge to explain, It's not like but there's some things I don't want to explain that I just can't explain, so I'm not trying to explain. But then I wonder how my silence on those issues gets felt. Like what is a silence that speaks? So that's hard too, Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like there is a lot of me that's untethered, but I find that those things that I'm participating with, I find a pleasure, right? And where I don't find it a pleasure, I don't think I'd necessarily be doing it. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like you almost have no opposition to yourself in a like positive way.
Yeah.
But
It's also just occurs. I feel like I'm just a person who really, really enjoys being confused, and being like, yeah, like, yeah, I don't get it, and it's like, it seems like so exciting, like a door's about to open, So I like it. Whereas I think some people are like, oh shit, this is gonna suck. I don't know, I'm not, I feel like there's a different fears. Like even my wife and I, like, she likes to know what's gonna happen tomorrow. She like goes through her date book right before bed. Can you imagine? She goes, dude, that's happening tomorrow. This is happening tomorrow, and then that's happening tomorrow. I don't want to know what's happening tomorrow, and in fact, sometimes I don't even know what's happening, because I don't want to know what's happening. I just want everything to be open in front of me all the time. So, it's like a bummer when anything has to happen.
Beautiful.
I just want all open all the time, and just take me where, the day would take me where it would go, Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. This isn't really a question. Well, I guess it's kind of a question. I just kind of want to hear more about. Okay, wait. Let me start over. So it just seems like so much of what drives your practice now is all of the learning that you've had in your life before you even formally, I guess, quote unquote, formally made work. And I think that hearing you talk about how you were like, yeah, I just did all this shit with my friends and it was so cool. And I learned so much about things before you even applied to a grad program where you talked about like not getting all the readings and stuff, but that like after school you just read as much as you could to like learn more about those things you didn't understand. But I don't know, I guess my question is more about how you see how your process has evolved from all of that learning you did before you even thought that you were gonna title yourself as an artist, because I think a lot of the energy and spirit in your earlier work is really just because you can tell that you were just doing it because it was so fun and that it meant so much to you in such a like special way. And I think that carries through in your practice now. But I just see like if there was like a, because now you're like, I don't know, now you're getting paid to talk about this amazing, all this stuff that you've done. And I think that's just like such an interesting way to think about your life and how your practice has changed and all the things that now are just like amazing stories that all you can do is be like, I've laughed harder than I ever had in this moment, but there's no way to capture how amazing that was. And the learning that and the friendship and the like camaraderie that came out of all those things, that how you see those pieces and the things that you make now. I don't know if that's a question, but I just wanted to hear more about that, because I think just hearing all the stories of things that you did and then you were like, oh, and then I applied to grad school. And like, it's just, I don't know, it's just kind of funny, but in this way that like, there's so much there about all the things that can happen, and the different ways that you figured out how to make things. And how this wasn't just, you weren't just like, I'm gonna start making sculptures. Like it all came from research because you were interested in all these things just in your life. I don't know.
I think it's important that, but like I said, I think that we are, trying to do stuff because of things that happened to us, or Derrida is thinking about Bing Bong because, something was like on his mind because of something that happened. Like he's interested because he's actually interested, he's not thinking, like a math guy, what is the hardest problem that hasn't been solved yet? I should work on that. It's not really like that. It's more like, where's my interests? And we can assume that we're interested for some reason, that's some biographical reason, I would assume. So, but, I was thinking about what you're saying about this kind of entering grad school, for example, and there was a kind of, moment there was an initial dot-com boom in San Francisco in 2000, in which San Francisco became completely inaccessible to most all my friends and I, except for those friends who joined up, they were a little computery, and so they were suddenly making 45 or 70 grand, whatever they were making. And, the rest of us are still making like 8 or 11 or whatever, and, and I thought, well, yeah, we're always thinking about what we're going to do when we grow up, you know, and we're like 36 or whatever. And so I think that there was an idea like, oh, we'll get grants. I'm a performer, I'll get grants. And then when you would look at who was receiving the grants, they all had an MFA. And I thought, oh, there's some kind of legitimizing certificate that I need. So I'll just go get that. And so when I went to BARD MFA, I thought, I just got to get the paper. You know, I'm going to do your thing, and then I'm going to get the paper. But then right away, some really, really interesting stuff started to happen, you know. And I started to, you know, meet my peers who were amazing. And then I started to read these texts, which I didn't understand, but which seemed amazing. And then I had a lot of shame about that I didn't know what the hell was going on. And I had come from this community, well, I'd come from AIDS activism where silence equals death, you know. And there was this idea like I should not be silent and hide the fact that I don't know shit because I'm ashamed, so I would talk even though I didn't know what the hell was going on. But, and so, you know, sort of working through that, making myself arrive even if it was difficult. And so, yeah, in some ways, I took it on as a civilizing force or domesticating force or a sort of like, you know, like Glissant says, you know, like, join with us so we can use you. You know, basically, if we see you, we can use you, and you can be part of, you know, you can gain privilege. So there was some aspect of that, especially right in the front membrane of it. But then different things started to happen, you know, and so it wasn't without, as you guys know, being here. It's not for the paper, you know, that you're here. It's to get to know each other, and to bend your mind in ways that are really erotic and fun, and suddenly the world's bigger, because you didn't even know that thought wasn't the whole thought. That there's 20 thoughts behind that thought, because now there's new vocabulary for the 20 thoughts behind the thought. And all these other experiences. So it was very rich and full. Yeah. And so, but yeah, I think that having all those experiences first, for a long time I was ashamed of that, you know. And that I've learned also to say it, you know, and to say like, you know, this is the path I chose. And for a long time when I was loving reading so much after grad school, I had a lot of grief about all the years that I didn't do that. I was like, what on earth were you missing by not like cracking this stuff open, you know? And so I had to also process that and just sort of figure out, oh, what I did was what I did, and it made me who I am. And everyone has their path. And it's not going away, you know, it's still there. And I think that it's important to know that even if we go through these institutions or these sort of organizing, it's like a filter, you know, or a channel where we maybe for a minute we all agree and crit, like this is the way we're going to do the crit this time, you know. But that's the thing is once you get out of school, it's not working like that. Everyone looks at art differently, you know. You may like what you did in that crit, but some of it falls away right away, you know. And you sort of pick and choose, and your body stays interested in certain things and it lets other things go. So I was very paranoid, obviously, but I don't think I needed to be. Does that make any sense? Does that answer your question?
I mean, my question didn't make sense.
I
so
know.
it's making
It was not a
sense.
question. It was a comment. It was a question comment. Talk about why you got old. Anyone else? All right. Ready to go eat? Do something different? All right. Thank you, everybody.